Okay, welcome back to our podcast. We're still talking to Douglas Wilson, who was here for our pastors' conference this year, and I wanted to continue, Doug, about one of the things. One of the things that came up a couple of times during our conference was the confessions, how the role of confessions, how they should be used, and the Westminster Confession in particular, and how it's being used today. And what have you what are some of your thoughts on this whole thing about what's going on now and the mentality that you see?
Well, let me answer the question by telling first or stating first where I am in regard to this. I'm as a minister of Christ Church in the CREC. I have subscribed to the Westminster Confession, the original English Westminster Confession. In the setup in the CREC, each church has to adopt the Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed, and the definition of Chalcedon, and then they have a choice of one of six reformational confessions of faith, the American Westminster and the English Westminster being the two of the options. So we used to subscribe to one of the other options, and it wasn't until the eruption of this particular controversy, the whole Federal Vision Auburn Avenue controversy, that we moved to adopt the Westminster Confession, and so I subscribed to the Westminster Confession within the last couple of years, and in the midst of this controversy, and so it's important to know what you're saying when you do that. What were we saying? And the fundamental thing that we were not saying is that the Westminster Confession is to be considered to be on a par with, either superior to or on a par with Scripture. So if you make it over Scripture, then of course that's a violation of the confession itself and all Christian sensibility, because the confession says that the Scripture is the final arbiter of all matters of faith and practice. But we could also do what the Roman Catholics do. We could also fall into their error by saying, well, in effect, the Scriptures and the Westminster Confession are on a par, and of course they don't ever contradict. Well, once you say that, the Roman Catholics say the Bible and our tradition never contradict. Well, that means that when you have apparent contradictions, you've got to resolve them one way or the other. And if you've got an a priori conviction that your church's tradition, whether it's the confession or it's more nebulous as it is in the Roman Catholic setting, you're going to cause the Scripture to conform to the confession instead of the other way around. So the confession has to be subordinated to Scripture, and that means honest subscription as opposed to strict subscription. I do not know any way of engaging in strict subscription where I believe every jot and tittle of the confession without that subscription being tantamount to a statement that the confession is equal to or superior to Scripture. And I just can't do that. So what we do is we say, all right, this is a shorthand way of telling everybody where we are. This is what we believe the Bible to teach. It's not that we believe this is the only thing the Bible teaches, but on the subjects it addresses, we believe this is a faithful representation of the Bible's instruction and teaching. And if we differ at any point with the confession, when we adopted it, we had a list of exceptions, which is a standard practice in Presbyterian circles. So that's what we've done. But the Westminster Confession doesn't say anything about evolution, nothing about Darwin, nothing about egalitarianism, nothing about feminism, nothing about some of the broader biblical historical developments in theology, which are subsequent to the drafting of the confession. And yet we can all conceive of faithful Christians confronting the errors of their day 200 years after the confession, and what they're confronting is something that the Westminster divines would cheer on were they here watching us. They would say, well, it's your responsibility to do in your generation what we did in our generation. And that's how we understand the confession.
Yeah, and that's really in conformity to the Reformed tradition of confession making, and that we've been the Reformed branch of the church has always been a church that's been willing to make confessions that are applied to the present situation that they face and the problems they face.
Right.
And I think the confession was doing the same thing.
Right. The confession, at the time the Westminster Confession was confessed, it was not only a living act, it was a courageous act. There were people involved, there were livelihoods involved, there were political authorities persecuting. It was an act of courage, and what just wonderful godly men did what they did. Well, we can't honor their courage by being cowards now, right? And we're not going to acquit ourselves as heroes by standing against errors that have been dead for 300 years, 350 years. The thing that's going to get us in trouble are the enemies that are alive and well now, and it takes courage to stand against them. And they're employing new vocabulary and new heresies and twists and turns. The reformers didn't have to deal with things like open theism. They didn't have, that was not on, well, actually the Socinians were back there, so they had a variant of it, but in its peculiar form now, they didn't have to do that. They didn't have to deal with modernity. So the Westminster Confession is in the middle of the 17th century, right at the same time that Descartes is sort of birthing modernity. So the Westminster Confession really is, you can almost describe it as the tail end of the medieval era. It's certainly before the rise of modernity in its full-fledged force. And modernity presents a potent challenge to the historic Christian faith. And the Westminster Confession was settled before modernity took shape in all its different forms.
Yeah, let me ask you about something you said in one of your talks, which was you used the analogy of the Westminster Confession being like the Queen Mum.
Yes.
Tell us about what you meant by that.
In all political, that illustration I think I first picked up from Joe Sobran, who was talking about the U.S. Constitution, where the Constitution is a written document that says certain things, that requires certain things, but people want to use it for ceremonial occasions instead. So people, when people take the oath of office, they swear to uphold and to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It's become part of our civic rituals, our civic liturgy. But if you gave the average congressman a copy of the Constitution, he'd be bewildered. What's this? What's this? and it'd be really interesting to how many of our judges and congressmen and representatives and bureaucrats and people running regulatory agencies, how many of them have actually read the Constitution? Well, not very few, and if they've read it, they're ignoring it. Well, but then at the same time, these same people, if some crisis hits or some disaster hits, they will invoke the Constitution. Right. They will appeal to the Constitution, whether the First Amendment or whatever. They appeal to the Constitution a lot. Well, the same thing happens in Reform circles. People appeal to the Westminster Confession and our Reformed tradition all the time. But it's a document that you can actually read and study, and it says things, right? And so if the U.S. Constitution says certain things, and then you look at what's being done, and you read it again, you say, well, how can they do, the 9th and 10th Amendments, for example, of the Constitution prohibit the vast majority of what's going on under the heading of the federal government. The 9th and 10th Amendments absolutely just prohibit what's going on, and yet it's still going on. Well, the same sort of thing is true in the Confession. In the Shorter Catechism and the Larger Catechism, it says, how are the two sacraments effectual means of salvation? It doesn't say, are they effectual means of salvation, with the expected answer being no, they are not. It assumes that they are effectual means of salvation and asks, in what manner are baptism and the Lord's Supper effectual means of salvation?